Hello and welcome, everybody. My name is Daniel Rothenberg. You're here to hear Peter Bergen present on his new book, The Rise and Fall of Osama bin Laden. Um, so, for many of you who are familiar with our work here at the Center on the Future of War, you're obviously familiar with Peter Bergen, who we both co-direct the center. Um, and we put this whole experiment together about little less than 8 years ago. And it's a partnership, for those who are less familiar, between Arizona State University and New America, a DC-based think tank. Um, at New America, Peter is vice president and head of global studies and fellows, and also professor of practice here at ASU. Um, our center has put together a variety of different programs, research projects, educational initiatives, and none of what we've been doing for the last 7.5 years would have been possible without Peter's hard work and his inspirational presence. And we're very fortunate to create this linkage and to have Peter as a colleague here at ASU. He's a journalist, documentary producer, a CNN national security analyst, and he's the author or editor of 9 books, 3 of which were New York Times bestsellers, 4 of which were named among the best nonfiction books of the year by the Washington Post. The books have been translated into 22 languages. He's also made a number of really extraordinary documentaries, several of which have been nominated for Emmys, and one won an Emmy for Best Documentary. So, again, many of you are familiar with Peter's work and with Peter himself. Maybe you've taken classes that he's taught or been a part of other events where he's spoken. So we're thrilled to have Peter here to talk about his new book. And what our process, as those of you know who've attended our other events, is that Peter will speak about the project, about the book, about his long work, his many years of working on the life of Osama bin Laden and al-Qaeda more generally. And then we'll go to a Q&A period. And for those who want to ask Peter any questions about his book or other aspects of his work, please drop those questions into the Q&A box within Zoom, and we'll try to get to as many of the questions as possible. And once again, thanks so much for joining us tonight.
Thank you, Daniel, for the introduction, and thank you everybody who's listening in. So my book is called The Rise and Fall of Osama bin Laden. One of the reasons I wrote the book is a class I taught with Professor Rothenberg. One of the students in the class at ASU asked if what was the difference between al-Qaeda and the Taliban, and that's a very interesting question. And I realized that for many people in the class, 9/11 was really an event that existed not in memory but in history. So undergrads at ASU were not born on 9/11 or were very, very young. Similarly, the 13 Marines and servicemen who were killed outside the Abbey Gate in Kabul airport, many of them were either not born or very, very young when 9/11 happened. And it seemed like a good time to re-examine the man behind 9/11. That was one motivation. The second motivation, obviously, it's the 20th anniversary. We've just passed that. It's obviously a good moment to reflect on this hinge event in American history. And then the third reason was there's been a great deal of documents that have come out over the last decade that have helped inform our understanding of bin Laden and al-Qaeda. Of course, the most important tranche of documents were the documents recovered in bin Laden's Abbottabad compound the night he was killed, May 1st, he was killed May 2nd, 2011 in Pakistan, in the United States, because of the time difference. It was May 1st. The SEALs picked up 100 thumb drives and other kinds of computer storage devices and quite a number of computers. And when that stuff was all triaged pretty quickly at CIA to see if there was anything of immediate intelligence value. And then the Trump administration released all the files in full in November of 2017. The Obama administration had released quite a number of the important materials in the files. There were 470,000 files. Many of them were kind of irrelevant. They were newspaper articles that bin Laden was reading. He wasn't reading newspapers. He was getting newspapers on thumb drives brought in by his bodyguard couriers. There were also books. There were various kinds of analyses of al-Qaeda that he was interested in. There was a whole slew of, there were children's cartoons that his kids were watching, but the material that was really useful amounted to about 6,000 pages of memos that bin Laden was writing, or senior leaders of al-Qaeda were writing to him. Also, letters that he was sending to his family. There was a 228-page family diary, which was handwritten in Arabic, which was a very important source for the book because it recorded the family discussions during the last weeks of bin Laden's life. You know, bin Laden recognized that the Arab Spring, which began in January of 2011, was probably the most momentous, in his own words, one of the most momentous events in the history of the Middle East in centuries. And yet bin Laden's ideas were not present in the Arab Spring. No one was holding up pictures of bin Laden in the protests of the Arab Spring. And this was very galling to bin Laden, and he and his two highly educated older wives, both of whom have PhDs. His oldest wife, Hamza, had a PhD in child psychology. Hamza means the mother of Hamza. She had married bin Laden when she was 35, a very late age to marry in Saudi Arabia. She'd had an independent career as a teacher of deaf-mute children. And she claimed descent from the Prophet Muhammad, which was very important to bin Laden, who saw himself in some way trying to replicate the Prophet Muhammad, even though that was a delusion. And she'd been living under house arrest after 9/11 in Iran for about a decade. She suddenly reappeared in bin Laden's life on February 15th, 2011, and came to his Abbottabad compound. And he was thrilled. He'd been writing her these kind of almost love letters as she was approaching him from Iran. And he was thrilled because he had a few things that he wanted to discuss with her, and also his other highly educated wife who was living with him, Sihan. She was age 54, same age as bin Laden when he was killed. She had a doctorate in Quranic grammar, was a poet, and edited bin Laden's speeches. So every night in the last weeks of bin Laden's life, they would gather before dinner and sometimes after dinner to talk about the Arab Spring and how bin Laden could position himself to take advantage of the Arab Spring. After all, they knew it was very important. But bin Laden didn't quite know what to say about it because the Arab Spring at its inception was carried out by ordinary people, liberals, members of the Muslim Brotherhood, and certainly not by jihadis. And in fact, one of the questions that went around the family table was, is it a problem the Arab Spring was achieved without jihad? And they realized that this was a problem. And another question was, is there a problem that al-Qaeda isn't really being mentioned right now? Bin Laden responded to that a bit defensively, saying, well, yes, some people are talking about al-Qaeda. So they recognized that this incredibly important event was going on without them. And the family thought, the two oldest wives, the two oldest daughters who were writing this family diary, and his oldest son, as they discussed the events, so every day bin Laden would watch lots of Al Jazeera coverage of the Arab Spring, and he would kind of comment on the day's events. His family would dutifully take down his thoughts. But the aim was that he would issue a big speech that would somehow make him relevant again and allow him to take charge of the Arab Spring. And that speech boiled down to bin Laden had one big idea, which was he would recommend that a council of religious scholars, probably very similar to the Taliban, should be set up, and that they would advise the new governments of the Middle East in Tunisia, Libya, and Egypt, where the Arab Spring revolutions were happening. And he actually recorded that speech, and it was later released by al-Qaeda 2 weeks after his death. Now, no one paid any attention to that because this idea of a council of religious scholars was not something that the people who were protesting during the Arab Spring, they were not interested in what bin Laden had to say. They weren't interested in this idea. But certainly, this was something that was very preoccupying bin Laden and his family in the last weeks of his life. Another preoccupation that bin Laden had that we discovered from these documents is the two bodyguards who've been with him since the Battle of Tora Bora when he escaped the Americans on December 12, 2001, shortly after the 9/11 attacks. the bodyguards had protected him for almost a decade, and they were two brothers. They were known as one of them was known as Abu Ahmed al-Kuwait, which means the father of Ahmed from Kuwait. They'd grown up in Kuwait, but their family was from northern Pakistan, in the area that bin Laden was basically hiding throughout the post 9/11 period. When he was in Pakistan, he traveled from Peshawar, a big city in northwest Pakistan, to Swat, which is a valley in the north of Pakistan, which is known as the Switzerland of Pakistan. He spent a year there. And then he went to a small provincial city in northern Pakistan called Haripur for 2 years. And then he finally ended up in Abbottabad with 3 of his wives and a dozen of his children and grandchildren. And the bodyguards were getting paid $100 a month. Bin Laden was always very tight with money. And they were fed up. They were getting paid relatively little. It was a dangerous job. As a result of this job, they had to lie to their own families about what they were doing, where they were living. And they began to have a dispute with bin Laden. The dispute became so bad that on January 15th, 2011, bin Laden wrote them a letter, even though they lived on the same compound. And in the letter, bin Laden said, we became so angry in our last discussion that I thought I'd put in writing what our agreement is. So bear in mind that the brothers that were protecting him lived only a few yards away from where he was living. And in that letter, he said, our agreement is that you will let me have until July of 2011 to find a new protector. Another big problem for bin Laden is the house, the carefully constructed hiding place that he had in Abbottabad with his, in places, 18-foot walls, was not in his name, but in the name of one of the bodyguards. And so not only was he losing the bodyguards, he was also losing this carefully constructed hiding place. And so this was weighing on his mind. Another worry that bin Laden had in the last weeks of his life was he was keenly aware that there hadn't been another attack on the United States by al-Qaeda and another successful attack. And he was constantly berating his top aides and also other leaders of other al-Qaeda affiliated groups, to really focus on the attacking the United States. And he was sort of instructing his team to try and kill President Obama, or try and kill General David Petraeus, who was then the commanding general in Afghanistan, try and kill then Vice President Joe Biden. And these were really pie in the sky ideas, because there was no way that al-Qaeda had the capacity to carry out these kinds of attacks. He was also very concerned about the upcoming anniversary of 9/11. It was the 10th anniversary of 9/11 was coming into view soon. He wanted to make a major statement. He wanted maybe to do another interview with an American TV network like CBS News. He wanted to do an interview with Arab journalists, Al Jazeera. He was talking to his team about how to arrange these. He was thinking about relaunching al-Qaeda itself as a kind of kinder, gentler al-Qaeda, thinking about renaming the group. He was particularly conscious of the fact that al-Qaeda and affiliated groups had killed a lot of Muslim civilians. Now, for a group that positioned itself as the defender of Muslim civilians, this was quite unimpressive. And bin Laden was, in the documents that we recovered in the Abbottabad, you constantly see bin Laden or one of his top aides writing to al-Qaeda in Iraq, or writing to al-Shabaab in Somalia, or writing to al-Qaeda in Yemen, or writing to the al-Qaeda affiliate in North Africa, and not only instructing them to try and attack American targets and stop attacking local targets, but also really very strongly insisting that they stop killing Muslim civilians. So bin Laden certainly saw this as his sort of Achilles heel, and this was another one of his preoccupations that become clear in the documents. So that's a little bit about the documents in Abbottabad that help explain bin Laden. Now, and I covered some of that material in the prologue of the book. Daniel Rothenberg was very helpful to me as I was writing the book, giving me critiques about, read the whole book very carefully and gave me a lot of very good critiques of the book. So the rest of the book is really the rise and the fall of bin Laden, and it follows a kind of chronological sequence. So the prologue begins with the last several weeks of his life, and in fact it begins the night that he dies. He's in bed with his favorite wife Amal, his youngest wife Amal, who's a Yemeni teen, married her when she was 16 and he was 43. They have 5 kids. Four of those kids they had when he was on the run in Pakistan, which is kind of extraordinary. I mean, just think about most fugitives don't take their 3 wives and a dozen kids and grandkids when they're on the run. But so the rest of the book covers the rise and the fall of bin Laden. The rise, of course, is, you know, he comes from a family of 54 siblings. They're all half siblings. I don't do too much armchair psychologizing in the book. I try and let the reader, let he or she kind of make their own determinations about kind of what seems important. I mean, it's not that I don't have my own views, but I don't want to overly impose them on the reader. One of my theories of the case is, you know, none of this was inevitable. You know, the shy religious teenager that bin Laden was didn't inevitably have to become the leader of al-Qaeda, the group that carried out the 9/11 attacks and killed, you know, tens of thousands of people around the world in places like Iraq and Syria and Afghanistan and Pakistan, as well as in the United States and Europe. And none of that was inevitable. You know, bin Laden had 54 siblings. As I mentioned, all of them are half brothers and half sisters. None of them went down bin Laden's path. Some of them were very pro-American, according to Steve Cole, who's written the former president of New America, who's now runs the Columbia School of Journalism, and wrote a very good book about bin Laden. About 1 in 4 of bin Laden's siblings attended an American university at some point. And bin Laden's oldest brother was, you know, profoundly pro-American and spent a lot of time in the United States and dated American women, had a house in Orlando. So, you know, bin Laden's anti-Americanism wasn't shared by most of his family, which would make sense because the family really owed their money to the marriage of convenience between the United States and Saudi Arabia that began when Standard Oil started prospecting in the kingdom in 1934. Now, bin Laden's father, Mohammed bin Laden, had arrived in the kingdom in 1930, and he had good timing. He was a bricklayer by profession. He'd come from Yemen, from a very, very extremely poverty-stricken part of Yemen. It's still very poverty-stricken, Hadramaut, which is sort of, you know, it's an area where we're stepping back from the Middle Ages today. And Mohammed bin Laden obviously wanted to make something of himself. He made the journey north. The Saudi kingdom, the third Saudi kingdom, was formed in 1932. Mohammed bin Laden, Osama's father, started ingratiating himself with the king. He would show up at the king's majlis, which is sort of a weekly meeting with the king, and he made himself indispensable as the king's contractor, rebuilding Mecca and Medina, rebuilding the Dome of the Rock in Jerusalem in 1967, and ingratiating himself with the Saudi royal family. He was killed in a plane crash when Osama bin Laden was 10. Bin Laden's parents were divorced when bin Laden was only 2. Bin Laden's mother is an Alawite, which is a heretical form of Shiism. If you're a kind of Sunni, Orthodox Sunni, as much of the Saudi kingdom is. And so bin Laden was sort of an outsider in multiple ways. His mother's an Alawite, so she subscribes to a heretical form of Shiism. His father was barely really ever in his life. According to bin Laden himself, only met his father 5 times and only had, it seems, 1 substantive conversation with him. His father died when he was 10 in this plane crash. That had a big impact on his life, according to his mother. And according to himself, he told his own family decades later that after his father's death, he became more religious. He started studying the Quran, managed to learn the Quran by heart, which is quite a feat of memory since 6,000 verses. And he became a very devout and religious teenager. He had a teacher at his school who was either a member of the Muslim Brotherhood or associated with it, who kind of turned him in a more militant direction. And at age 17, he married a Syrian cousin, starts having the first of his first kids. He has 20 kids. He has 5 wives, one divorced him. And it is the invasion of the Soviet Union to Afghanistan in '79 that really kind of transforms his life. he starts traveling to Pakistan between 79 and 84 fairly regularly, bringing money to the Afghan groups fighting the Soviets. In 1984, he goes into Afghanistan for the first time. In 1987, he sets up a base in Afghanistan. It's known as al-Qaeda, the base. That base is in eastern Afghanistan. It was bin Laden positioned it near a Soviet military outpost in order for it to attract enemy fire, which is, doesn't make any sense from a military point of view. He recruited a number of idealistic young Saudis, many of whom were determined to die. Some of them did. Bin Laden really had, he had no military experience to speak of. The people who were fighting with him also, Jamal Khalifa, who was his brother-in-law, came to visit him and said, you should stop doing this. You're going to get young men killed. You don't know what you're doing. In 1988, he was the subject of a profile by Jamal Khashoggi, the Saudi journalist who was murdered in 2018 by Saudi officials. Jamal Khashoggi was the first sort of mainstream journalist from the Arab press who profiled bin Laden. And this sort of profile turned bin Laden into something of a household name in Saudi Arabia. He was lionized when he came back. His views were sought. He would speak at public gatherings. He would speak at mosques. He would talk about the war. He would talk about his own views. And in 1988, he formally founded al-Qaeda, which had already existed in an informal sense. And the idea was to take the people who'd been fighting in the Afghan war and direct them at other jihads. In bin Laden's case, what he was interested in was overthrowing the then socialist government of southern Yemen. Southern Yemen and northern Yemen reunited, and the Saudis basically backed the new government, and they had no interest in bin Laden sort of taking a private army to Yemen and getting involved in a fight there. They also had no interest in when bin Laden offered his men to fight Saddam Hussein after he invaded Kuwait. And bin Laden tried to intervene in the Afghan civil war with little effect. By 1990, he's looking for another place to go. He goes to Sudan. He's in exile in Sudan until 1996. He gets booted out of Sudan. In Sudan, it's where he first begins plotting really seriously against American targets, including trying to kill American servicemen in Somalia who were there for Operation Restore Hope, a humanitarian mission to feed starving Somalis. They also blew up a bomb at a Yemeni hotel that was housing American servicemen. None of this was noticed by the US really at the time. It's only in 1993 that somebody I profile in the book, Gina Bennett, writes the first warning about bin Laden in the classified memo. She's a fairly junior analyst at the State Department. She starts focusing on bin Laden and his so-called Afghan Arabs, people, which was one of the kind of unexpected outcomes of the Cold War, was this group of guys who fought against the Soviets or had some role in that war, who when they went home started joining or founding jihadist groups in Algeria and Bosnia and Chechnya. Gina Bennett thought that this was a problem. Late February 93, some of these Afghan Arabs bombed the Trade Center in New York City. Their aim was to bring it down. Luckily, they didn't, but they killed 6 people. And so suddenly now these Afghan Arabs are not only joining jihadist groups, they're attacking the United States. But Gina Bennett is one of only a handful of officials in the US government who really recognizes the threat posed by these folks, because they're not, the kind of conventional wisdom at the time is, terrorists were supported by states. They were not sort of individual, basically just groups without state support. They tended to be, al-Qaeda was something new. It wasn't supported by a state. It was made up of all sorts of different nationalities. And bin Laden was seen at the time as a financier of Islamic extremism. And then in 97, we interviewed him for CNN, which was his first television interview, in which he declared war on the United States for the first time to a Western audience. Again, this wasn't really noticed much because he hadn't really done anything, or it seemed like he hadn't done anything yet. We didn't really know that he actually had done some things. It wasn't clear. Fast forward to the embassy attacks in 98, that became very clear that bin Laden was going to try and kill as many people as possible, had no compunction about killing civilians, including Muslim civilians. Bombs went off in Kenya and Tanzania, which have substantial Muslim populations. And then, of course, you come to 9/11. And then I traced the long hunt for bin Laden, try and explain what happened to al-Qaeda during that decade, and end with his, the operation that kind of finally captured, finally track him down, and then of course he was killed, and then try and think about kind of what his legacy was or is. And I think the legacy, one of the interesting things about the documents that were recovered in Abbottabad that's relevant to today is the extent to which bin Laden was corresponding with the Taliban. They maintained warm and cordial relations throughout this period. Bin Laden wrote letters to Mullah Omar just before he was killed. He was in touch with al-Qaeda leaders, were in touch with other Taliban leaders. They were giving money to elements of the Taliban, including the Haqqani network, which is now very much part of the government and Taliban controlled Afghanistan today. And so the documents reveal that al-Qaeda and the Taliban never really separated. That was always wishful thinking. And of course, they haven't separated today. The UN describes Siraj Haqqani, who is the Minister of Interior of the Taliban, as part of the leadership council of al-Qaeda. So here you have, for the first time, a member of al-Qaeda who's got a cabinet position, and that's in the Taliban-controlled government, in the Taliban government of Afghanistan today. So that's where we end, and the Taliban control of Afghanistan, I think, unfortunately, provides another iteration of what we've seen in the past, which is a safe haven for jihadists from which they can train people. They can also inspire people, because you don't need to. The ISIS model was not just that you train people to carry out attacks to the West, as we saw in Paris, but also just to inspire people to carry out attacks in the West, as we saw in Orlando, Florida, as we saw in San Bernardino, California. The perpetrators of those terrorist attacks never went to Iraq or Syria, but they saw themselves as soldiers of ISIS, soldiers of the caliphate, and carried out these attacks and terrorist attacks in the name of ISIS. And I think, unfortunately, we may see some of the same thing emanating from Afghanistan today. Whether that's Europeans training there, whether that's jihadist groups declaring victory and sort of trying to inspire attacks in the West. And I suspect that we'll see some of that in the next 2 or 3 years. So I'll leave it there, and I'll take any questions you might have.
Thank you so much, Peter. The book is really, it's quite a great book. It's been very well reviewed for those of you out there, and it's worth getting a copy. It really is, so, you've been writing about Osama bin Laden and al-Qaeda for a number of years. You were part of the team that did the initial interview with Osama bin Laden in Afghanistan long before his name became popularly known. And looking back at all this time and the 20 years of the longest wars in Afghanistan, what do you think is the most significant takeaway for the general public about reflecting on the figure of Osama bin Laden and his significance and the fight to both against al-Qaeda and to capture and eventually kill him? What does all of this mean now, some 20 years after 9/11?
Okay, I think my video is stopped for some reason.
Oh. So Selena, I can see Peter. I don't know. Can you?
I can see Peter as well.
Okay, good.
I think it's okay. Yeah, let's go ahead.
Okay, good. Sorry about that. What's the significance? I mean, I think bin Laden is one of the very few people who changed history. One of the reasons that I wrote the book is the number of people who actually changed history is not a huge number. But if you think about the first 20 years of the 21st century, from 9/11 till now, American foreign policy was largely the war on terror, which bin Laden basically initiated with the 9/11 attacks. And that had a series of, I think, very unexpected outcomes, not the ones that bin Laden thought. Bin Laden thought he was going to attack us on 9/11. And then the United States would pull out of the Middle East, and the client regimes like the Saudis and the Egyptians would fall. That was his strategy. He did have a strategy, except it was a very long-headed strategy, and we didn't pull out of the Middle East. In fact, the United States is more, fought wars in Afghanistan, Iraq, various kinds of military operations in Pakistan, Somalia, Libya, Yemen, and all of those really resulted from 9/11. And so bin Laden didn't get what he wanted out of 9/11, but he did change history. He did, but not in the ways that he expected. So the reason that, the reason I'm interested, and I think the reason anybody, with an interest in history might be interested, is this was really his idea, his strategic conception. 9/11, there was a fair amount of internal opposition to the 9/11 scheme within senior leaders of al-Qaeda. There was definitely opposition to the idea of attacking the United States in general from other jihadi leaders who talked to bin Laden, who didn't necessarily know about the 9/11 plot. He ignored all this advice, and the advice basically, came in sort of three categories. One, the United States is going to really respond if you do a big attack, particularly in the United States. Two, this could be very bad for the Taliban, who after all are hosting us. And three, this is against Islam. Some people were even saying, killing civilians. So this is all very good advice that bin Laden ignored. And it was his strategic conception. One of the takeaways from the book is the extent to which this is really bin Laden. There was a narrative after 9/11 that Ayman al-Zawahiri, who leads al-Qaeda now, was sort of the brains of the operation. Well, that was really there's no evidence for that. Ayman al-Zawahiri was very focused on attacking Egypt. He was kind of a marginal figure in the pre-9/11 al-Qaeda. Didn't have really, just a handful of followers. Bin Laden had this fairly large organization. He had the money and he had the ideas. And Zawahiri was sort of a bit player. And so that's, the significance is because this act changed history and changed history in unexpected ways.
So thanks so much for those in the audience who are putting your questions into the Q&A box. The first question here is from an excellent student in our MA in Global Security, Abdulaziz Weli, who says, after 30 years, are there things we have still not figured out about al-Qaeda or terrorists in general? And he means as regards US strategy in response to al-Qaeda and terrorists in general.
So, meaning other facts that we don't know, or approaches we haven't tried, or what's the kind of point of the question, do you think?
So I'm not exactly sure. So I'll just sort of take the moderator's view and say, given all of the attention that's been focused on Osama bin Laden and on al-Qaeda, what do you think that the U.S. over all these years fundamentally missed, got wrong, somehow failed to understand?
Well, I mean, there were, the United States got lots of things wrong. I mean, I don't think anybody who listens to this call, probably shares these views. But I mean, that we started with the idea that al-Qaeda attacked us because of our freedoms. That was a kind of common view. Whereas, bin Laden was very clear it was about our foreign policy. And then, for years after the 9/11 attacks, the Bush administration was very successful in planting the idea that Saddam Hussein was somehow involved in 9/11, even though the largest criminal investigation in history definitively showed that's not the case. But that was very important for the case for the Iraq War. And as I say in the book, the Iraq War essentially has saved al-Qaeda, because al-Qaeda was devastated by the initial American response to the 9/11 attacks. Even close allies of bin Laden, they weren't saying this publicly, but to themselves, they were saying, wow, this was a total fiasco. And so along comes the Iraq War, and this is exactly what bin Laden sort of predicted, that the United States was interested in empire building in the Middle East and was interested in oil. Iraq does have oil, Afghanistan doesn't have oil. And of course, Iraq is an Arab country, it's in the heart of the Middle East. And as a result of which, al-Qaeda in Iraq, which had no presence in Iraq before Saddam Hussein, when Saddam Hussein was in control, basically helped to spark a civil war that I think we're still dealing with today, which is, what are the big changes that have happened since 9/11? The biggest change, I think, for me, or for any observer, I think, is the rise of sectarianism in the Middle East, which has always existed, but has become so much more virulent. And it was really the original sin in all of this was the bizarre invasion of Iraq, because that set the conditions for al-Qaeda in Iraq to spark a sectarian civil war, which they wanted to do. And they were very successful at that. And of course, al-Qaeda in Iraq then morphed into ISIS and spread that sectarian civil war to Syria. And we're also seeing elements of the sectarian civil war in Yemen. And of course, now it's powered by Iran and the Saudi states. But I think that if if the United States hadn't invaded Iraq as a result of linking Saddam Hussein to 9/11, things would have been very different. But that did happen. So we the United States made lots of mistakes, but the jihadis also make their own mistakes. And the United States, because it's an open society, tends to self-correct its mistakes. I mean, if you look at the second Bush term, he closed the CIA secret prisons because of decisions by the Supreme Court. Guantanamo detainees had lawyers. Their names became public. Coercive interrogations ended. There was kind of some of the excesses began sort of being pushed back. And now there is a sort of Republicans and Democrats kind of agree on a playbook against jihadi groups, which is drone attacks, special operations, special forces, and cyber warfare. And presidents as different as Biden, Trump, Obama, and Bush have all basically kind of endorsed that approach. And so there is a kind of commonality of approaches to the problem that I think American presidents going forward are unlikely to significantly change. Yes, Joe Biden's pulled out of Afghanistan, but he hasn't. There's still U.S. troops in Iraq. I think things can change in Afghanistan, where President Biden or President Kamala Harris or President Mark Rubio, some future president he or she may decide that we need to go back, just as President Obama did in Iraq with the rise of ISIS. And I think there are three circumstances in which that could be triggered. One, Taliban engages in ethnic cleansing in a systematic, large-scale way, which is quite possible. Two, Taliban or jihadi groups in Afghanistan start killing Americans or dual nationals. Three, groups in Afghanistan train people for attacks in the West, not necessarily in the United States. All of those could kind of change the political calculus, or they train people for attacks on American targets in the region. So those are four circumstances, and you can imagine all four of them happening in the next 2 or 3 years, where an American president might say, we made a mistake by pulling out, and we should go back.
A question here from Eve Justice. In your opinion, what may have transpired had Osama bin Laden not been killed by the Navy SEALs? What would have happened if he'd been imprisoned and isolated? Would he have become an even greater persona?
There was a plan, but the briefing books that were very, very big, that the members of Obama's war cabinet had in front of them when the operation happened. And they kind of considered every eventuality, that bin Laden would be wounded and not killed, or he'd just be captured. And the plan for that was to take him to Bagram Air Base, which was, the biggest base in Afghanistan, and and particularly if the operation remained secret, and to kind of interrogate him there for months potentially. There was a FBI. There was kind of a special high-value target FBI team that was on standby to debrief him at Bagram Air Base. He might have been taken perhaps also to an American ship for this debriefing. So there was certainly a plan to, if he was captured alive, about what to do with him. But I think the expectation was that it would not be announced. The operation was supposed to be secret. It became that it got overtaken by events. If the helicopter hadn't crashed in the compound, it may well have become secret. But it became not a secret because you have this spectacular crash of a helicopter, and it's clearly not a Pakistani helicopter in the compound. From that point forward, the operation was no longer secret. Now, if bin Laden then was eventually put on trial, clearly that would have been quite a circus. But the U.S. court system, the federal court system, has a pretty good track record of convicting terrorists. In the Southern District of New York, which after all is only 2 or 3 blocks from where the Trade Center is, but he might have been sent to Guantanamo. Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, the leader of the 9/11 attacks, the operational commander, is still in Guantanamo. He still hasn't had a trial. That he was captured in Pakistan 14 years ago. So unfortunately, the Guantanamo system has proven to be very lengthy and really kind of counterproductive in terms of convicting people by their own account who've engaged in these terrorist attacks. But yeah, if he'd been captured, he would have, I think, probably ended up for many months being debriefed, and then eventually he probably would have been taken to Guantanamo.
So a question here from one of our colleagues, Bruce Puggle, former JAG officer. Some have suggested, including President Biden, that killing Osama bin Laden should have been the end of the U.S. mission in Afghanistan. I take it you don't agree, but how much did killing Osama bin Laden actually degrade al-Qaeda's operational capacity or its strategic objectives?
Well, I think killing bin Laden, the most important outcome was justice for the victims of 9/11 and their families. I think there was a sense that it was justice had been served. He didn't surrender in a conspicuous manner, which if he'd done, then he would have been taken, he would have been captured. I think from an operational point of view, it probably didn't make a huge amount of difference. I think it was more important from a sort of psychological point of view. Bin Laden was still in charge of al-Qaeda, or trying to be, but it was problematic for him to communicate with his affiliates because he had to do it through couriers. It was like running a business in the mid-19th century without having access to telegraph or phone or internet. And so messages would get lost, or they would take a long time to get to their recipients. The recipients might not reply, or pretend they had got the letter, or they did reply. The reply could get lost, or it could take a long time to get back. So bin Laden was trying to micromanage his organization, and he was successful given the fact that there were a lot of constraints around logistics. I mean, he for instance, nixed the idea of Anwar al-Awlaki, the Yemeni American cleric, taking over al-Qaeda in Yemen. He was instructing al-Qaeda in Yemen not to set up an Islamic State in Yemen, which at the time wasn't right. He told al-Shabaab in Somalia not to identify itself as an al-Qaeda affiliate because it would be bad fundraising. And these instructions were actually heeded. Other instructions were not. So he was trying to remain in operational control, but the group, al-Qaeda itself was, very much a shadow of its former self. Was President Biden right to say, we could have used the death of bin Laden as an effort to kind of end the war in Afghanistan? Yeah, I mean, I don't think, but there's various, by the time President Obama had an interesting decision, not dissimilar to President Biden and President Trump, about what to do about Afghanistan. And President Obama had a lively discussion in 2015 and 2016 in the Situation Room over the course of quite a long period of time. And he concluded that the downside of just completely getting out of Afghanistan was outweighed by, the leaving 8,400 troops, is what Obama did, was kind of like buying yourself life insurance to ensure that Afghanistan didn't revert to Taliban control and then jihadis sort of having free reign there. And I think that was a sensible decision. And obviously there were people in Trump's cabinet like H.R. McMaster who were advocating to kind of keep a certain number of troops, increase the number of troops when up to 14,000 at one point. And then Joe Biden said that he was constrained by the Trump peace negotiations with the Taliban, which were basically a joke. The Taliban only observed one part. Their agreement was to separate from al-Qaeda, enter into real peace negotiations with the Afghan government, and not attack American troops. They did not attack American troops, but they did not separate from al-Qaeda. They didn't negotiate with the Afghan government for some sort of power sharing arrangement, and now they control the country. So yeah, I am opposed to the idea of just pulling the plug completely from Afghanistan, because I think you look what we have. We have a very hardline Taliban government that is dominated by members of the Afghani network, which are close to al-Qaeda. They have essentially banned women from any kind of occupation. The mayor of Kabul said that women can work, but only in jobs like cleaning toilets for females. The Kabul University is no longer, many women can really, females are not getting educated past the sixth grade. And so, and the Taliban, I think, are, it's not Taliban 2.0. It's the same old Taliban that I witnessed when I was there before 9/11. And I think that President Biden is going to come to regret making this decision, because we've seen how this movie unfolds, and I'm not quite sure why it would be different this time.
Here's a question from an attendee. If you had the opportunity to speak to Osama bin Laden before he was killed, what would you ask him?
I think a question that he would have had a hard time answering. He was asked a very good question, and I include it in the book by his bodyguard. Abu Jandal was his Yemeni bodyguard. He published a book in French in 2011, which was then translated in English, I think, in 2014. Anyway, Abu Jandal knew bin Laden very well. He was quite close to him. And when the embassy attacks happened in '98, Jandal said, "Why did you kill so many civilians?" And bin Laden sort of laughed and said, "Well, we gave these interviews, including to CNN. And after we gave these interviews, our sort of Islamic duty to warn had been done, and anybody who was near an American target should have known not to be there." And then Abu Jandal, who'd spent time in Kenya, said, "Well, what about all the Muslim civilians that were killed in these attacks?" And bin Laden said, "Well, we carried out the attack at 10:30 on a Friday morning, and any observant Muslim should have been at the mosque." So I think these were good questions to ask. I mean, why is it okay to kill civilians when the Quran is pretty clear on the fact that civilians are not to be killed during times of war? Why kill so many Muslim civilians is another question. And even bin Laden himself began to realize that that was really a real question. Bin Laden subscribes to a particular kind of view of the world, that he felt that, if you're not an Orthodox Muslim, you too might be, if you were collateral damage in his war. He didn't really care. I think that view changed over time. So the question really is around the question of killing civilians, killing Muslim civilians. Those are the questions I think that he would have the hardest time dealing with.
A question from David Pickus. I understand you to say that bin Laden first became a celebrity in Saudi Arabia after an interview by Jamal Khashoggi. What was his appeal at the time? It doesn't seem like his wider views were original to him. So why bin Laden?
I think his appeal at the time was, the anti-Soviet war was seen as a very legitimate war by all sorts of people around the world, including the United States. And here is this guy, son of a billionaire, fighting himself on the front lines rather heroically and leading the Saudis into battle. Now, of course, there's no record of any of the several thousand Saudi princes ever fighting against the Soviets. And here is this son of a very rich man from a very prominent family in Saudi, personally leading them into battle. And I think it was a heroic story. And whatever else bin Laden was, in this instance, he was not a coward. He was fighting on the front lines against the Soviets. He actually set up this base, al-Qaeda, as close to a Soviet military post so that the Soviets would attack it, which they did. And there was a pretty large scale battle, nothing that changed the course of the war, but in which 13 of bin Laden's men were killed. The Afghans who were in the area came in, basically saved the day. More than 200 of them kind of saved bin Laden and his men from Soviets. But I think the appeal was he's fighting the Soviets, and he comes from this prominent family, and this is a conflict that the Saudis were supporting with matching CIA money. Each put in $3 billion to support the various Afghan factions. And so it was a popular war in the Muslim world and also in the West. And here was bin Laden leading his men into battle. Now, in bin Laden's mind, he had a decisive role in defeating the Soviets, which was crazy. The number of Afghans fighting the Soviets at any given moment is estimated to be 175,000 to 250,000. Bin Laden had, at most, maybe 100 or 200 at any given time, men on the battlefield, and they couldn't affect the course of the war, and they didn't.
Question here about the current situation in Afghanistan. To what degree is al-Qaeda linked, affiliated with the current Taliban-run government in Afghanistan? And to what degree is ISIS a potential threat to that state?
Well, we did see an attack, interestingly, in just in recent days against the funeral of the mother of the Taliban spokesman, who's fairly prominent. And that attack may have been carried out by ISIS-K, we don't know. But, I mentioned earlier, Siraj Khani is the Minister of the Interior, which is kind of like being the head of the Department of Homeland Security and the head of the FBI. He is described by the United Nations as being on the leadership council of al-Qaeda. So, I mean, there is a very tight linkage between the current leadership of the Taliban and al-Qaeda. And it's a stronger linkage than existed before 9/11 when I was reporting on the Taliban. At that time, there were people in the Taliban who were very opposed to bin Laden because they thought he was kind of conducting independent foreign policy and he was ignoring Omar. Now you've got people who are closely affiliated with al-Qaeda who are part of the Taliban government. So, I mean, I just think that speaks for itself.
Looking back on all of your work on the life of Osama bin Laden and on al-Qaeda as an organization, its various permutations, and the 20 years of US military and other engagement to try to defeat al-Qaeda, does it all seem like a great strategic miscalculation on the US's part and perhaps a failure?
Well, I mean, it depends which part of it you're talking about. I don't think a lot of things went right in Afghanistan. We know all the things that went wrong, but I mean, the rise of independent media, the denial of safe haven to al-Qaeda, the advances women and girls have had in Afghanistan, that all went right. And the Iraq War, I've already explained where I think that went wrong. So, I mean, I think it depends on which part of this conflict you're looking at. Of course, there hasn't been an attack by a foreign terrorist organization on the United States for 2 decades, which I think speaks for itself. The only attack of any significance is even remotely traceable to a foreign terrorist organization that was successful was the attack in Pensacola in December of 2019 that killed 3 American sailors that had some links to al-Qaeda in Yemen. But that's the sort of exception that proves the rule. So if the standard of, what ultimately commander-in-chief, the president of the United States, his or her job is to keep Americans safe. And by that standard, the war went pretty well. But I think, the war also had lots of unintended consequences. So, I don't have a good answer, Daniel, because I think it's 20 years and these conflicts played out in lots of different places. And sometimes the outcome was good and sometimes the outcome was bad. And sometimes the outcome is sort of neutral. And I think it really depends about which conflict we're talking about when we discuss this, and also at what phase of the conflict. Because I think going back to the question about that I think Bruce had earlier, we want part of this. One of our big problems throughout this is sort of like, what do we name things? But I think the Afghan war became something of a misnomer, at least on the American side, as we sort of drew down to very several thousand soldiers, and I think there was a politically sustainable number of soldiers that in addition to our NATO allies, when we pulled our 2,500, 3,500 troops out of Afghanistan, 7,000 mostly NATO troops, and also pulled out 16,000 contractors pulled out, 6,000 of American contractors who were kind of keeping the Afghan Air Force alive because we'd given them these complicated helicopters and jets, which could not be serviced by the Afghans. So it wasn't just that we took our relatively small number of troops; everybody else then left as well, and every embassy closed. So I think that was an avoidable mistake, and I don't think that I think that when the Biden administration says they were bound by the Trump agreement, I don't think that's true, because the Taliban weren't observing the agreement. They're not a state. This was not a ratified treaty by the Senate. This was merely an agreement with a terrorist insurgent group, which they didn't observe, which the Afghan government had actually no part in, which is the legitimate elected Afghan government. And of course, the Taliban have never participated in elections, and I don't think they would do very well in an election. They would do okay in certain parts of the country. but it's not like they have a huge amount of legitimacy with every other ethnic group that isn't Pashtun, with everybody who lives in cities, and with old women who no longer can work, and anybody who's got an education. So I think that the war that took place in Afghanistan, just returning to your question, in 2009, where I was in helmet with the Marines, there was 100, bin Laden surged. This was actually 2010. Bin Laden surged the troops into Afghanistan. There were 100,000 troops. That war, that was a real war, which the United States was a major party to. But over time, the number of troops on the ground really declined, and it became a different kind of war. So we'll see. I mean, let's have this conversation 3 years from now, see where Afghanistan is, see if some of the more dire predictions have come to pass or not. But nobody listening to this call could possibly have predicted a year ago that the Taliban would be in total control of Afghanistan by the 20th anniversary of 9/11. That would have seemed a very pessimistic assessment. But as soon as President Joe Biden started talking publicly about pulling out, which he started doing in April and kind of reconfirmed in July, the Afghans saw which way this was going. And it's not, there's been a narrative the Afghans didn't fight, which is total nonsense. The Afghans have lost 66,000 soldiers in this war, which is, a large number. And they have fought, but they're also not content. Once they saw that the Taliban, they're no longer getting air support because the contractors have pulled out, no longer getting medevac support. They want to keep their heads on their shoulders. They started surrendering because they saw which way the wind is blowing. And I'm 58, someone of my age has, basically seen Afghanistan at war since they were a teenager. The war really began in 1978 and not in 79 when the Soviets invaded. So there's been 43 years of war, and there's been multiple changes of government. And Afghans are very aware of this history, and it's not that they've embraced the Taliban, it's that they saw that the Taliban seemed unstoppable, and they surrendered. Now, this can change also. The Taliban militarily, I think, are in a much better place than they were before 9/11 because they've got all this American military equipment. They're a bigger force, a more battle-hardened force. But that said, the Tajiks and the Hazaras and the Uzbeks, if they feel completely excluded, which they clearly are already, and if there's ethnic cleansing against them, they're going to take up arms, and it may take years, it may take a decade, it may, but there will be another civil war because I don't think the Taliban ultimately really represent, they do bring peace, but they bring it at a very, very steep price, particularly if you're not a Pashtun, particularly if you don't subscribe to their view of Sharia law. And we'll see.
Well, thank you so much, Peter Bergen, co-director of the Center on the Future of War, professor of practice at ASU, vice president of New America. It's great to have you here, and thank you all to our audience for spending some time with us this evening. Our next event is October 19th with another major thinker who's been dealing with issues related to the war on terror and particularly U.S. domestic policies, Karen Greenberg, a close friend of the Center and of New America. She'll be speaking on her new book, Subtle Tools, The Dismantling of American Democracy from the War on Terror to Donald Trump. Again, that's October 19th from 5 to 6 p.m. If you're on our mailing list, you'll get the invitation for that event. And thank you so much to all of you for joining us tonight. And again, thank you, Peter.
Thank you.